Hi and welcome to Lunch Bytes. This is the third event of the series in London. Lunch Bytes is a discussion series on digital culture and art, which was actually initiated in 2011 in Washington, D.C., when the Goethe Institute D.C. and the Hirscher Museum and Sculpture Garden initiated the project and asked me to come up with a program on digital culture. This year, Lunch Bytes was launched as a European edition. It's initiated by the Goethe Institute again, by the Goethe Institutes in the region Northwestern Europe. And throughout this year, events are taking place in a couple of cities, namely Amsterdam, Copenhagen, Dublin, Glasgow, Helsinki, London, and Stockholm. The project will be concluded with a conference in Berlin in March next year at the Haus der Kulturen der Welt. In all of these cities, we work together with partner institutions, as you see them listed on the slide, and it's a great honor and privilege to work with 3 institutions here in London, Arcadia Missa, the ICA, and the Digital Culture Unit of Goldsmiths, University of London. There is one final event coming up in London as well later this year. It will deal with the topic of language, and it will take place on the 22nd of November. Today's talk will deal with the concept of the commons, and the talk will be chaired by Helen Kaplinsky, sitting at the outer edge here. She's a curator based in London. With her on stage are Julia Tcharfas, sitting there. She's a curator and an artist, also based in London. Stephan Dillemuth, Munich-based artist and professor. Eleanor Saitta, she's not so easily, how can I say, you're based everywhere. And she's a hacker and an advisor and a designer, just to name a few of her hats. And then also Daniel van der Velde, representing Metahaven, a design and research collective from Amsterdam. Before we go into the discussion and I hand over to Helen, I would like to thank all the partners involved. I would like to thank the Goethe Institute, Eva Schmidt, the head of the cultural department, as well as Mario Schroef, the cultural coordinator. He's also sitting somewhere here. Then the 2 directors of Arcadia Missa, Rosa Farkas and Tom Clark, as well as Matthew Fuller, also sitting here from Goldsmiths University, and of course, Rosalie Duval from the ICA. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you, Melanie, for initiating this conversation, and thanks everyone for coming along today. So I just want to mention that the hashtag for this conversation is ICA London, and that's for comments, not questions. You have to be in the room to ask a question, which you'll get a chance to do at the end. Before I allow the speakers to present their version of the commons today, I would just like to provide a brief awareness of the landed commons in an English context. And this isn't a claim that the commons is exclusively English in any way. There are many other cultures that include nomadic, non-propertied communities of shared time and space, such as a potlatch or dream time. But in this country, one can trace 3 stages of privatisation and enclosure of public space and resources that continue today. And the first enclosure being the commons, the commonly held heath and scrubland, which in a piecemeal manner has been taken into private and commercial use during industrialisation. So common land is land owned and worked in common, and historically it provided minimum welfare for the poorest, enabling them to sustain pasturage, grazing livestock, fishing, tubery, burning turf, estover, which is building and with wood and collecting for firewood, and also included the right to glean, which is to collect the leftovers of crops after harvest. So during the Anglo-Saxon period from the 5th to the 11th centuries, all village land was assumed to be commonly owned and worked, with the exception of a few enclosed areas. And following the Norman conquest of 1066, land was associated with a local manor and therefore owned by its lord, who bestowed rights to work the land to commoners. And then from the 16th and throughout the 17th century, land previously granted as common by landlords was gradually enclosed and put to more economically efficient use, or apparently economically efficient. And during the 18th and 19th century, with the Industrial Revolution in full swing, enclosure became a centrally led government policy. A second stage of enclosure can be identified in Thatcher's policy of privatisation of publicly run services and the selling off of council housing, and now Labour's hybrid of private finance initiative for the NHS and schools that the Tories have continued. Also, you have the Big Society, which is the latest agenda, encouraging individuals and communities to take responsibility, which returns this urgency to the question of the role of the state and individuals in producing a third space. So, the most recent stage of enclosure is that of the online landscape. And whilst Creative Commons and share economy is apparently built upon a peer-to-peer horizontal model, the public are increasingly aware that their valuable data is being collected by these platforms that mediate their exchanges. So today, when we speak about the commons, this refers to a claim for access to shared resources, time and space, as well as the freedom from surveillance or intellectual property online. And while the introduction of the landlord was pivotal in the structuring of property and can be seen as the beginnings of capitalism as we know it, was it naive to ever understand the internet as anything other than a reflection of the structural inequalities of IRL space? So today our speakers are going to look at the commons in relation to artistic practice and their respective other practices, including graphic design, security, etc., that Melanie explained, and to think about who's responsible for producing the commons, maintaining them, and do they still exist, and if so, where and how. So I'm going to hand over to Stephan to kick things off.
Okay. Okay. Before I was asked to present one or two artistic projects I was involved with, but before that I wanted also to have some preliminary remarks regarding the topic here, namely that we should be quite careful of what we're doing and how we are talking about this. As we see here, government side already is trying to make research and to basically promote the sharing economy, and that's, I think, also what's in the news in the last days, that some of these which we things that we could call maybe platform capitalism is expanding and grabbing into these questions of commons, of sharing quite quickly. So as an artist, that's what we learned in the past 20 years. We are always basically in the situation that we have to ask ourselves in how far we are not working for those which we want to criticize, voluntary or not. If you maybe, I hope that the discussion later goes into these critical questions. This, if you want to know more about my work in general, this is the Society of Control, where I gather a couple of projects. It's interesting here that the pirate pad seems to be not working right now because the pirate party in Germany is quite in trouble these days. A lot of protagonists were leaving the party, and what's left is basically that they have to invent themselves from scratch, or I don't know, just leave the realm of politics altogether, which would be a shame, but also that could be possible to discuss in how far, let's say, the digital realm and a lot of politics connected to the digital realm can enter or have entered the public political discourse already. So we are moving here maybe towards some projects of mine and not so mine, collaborative projects as well. I was asked to talk about specific time. It was the early 90s in Cologne where I started to run a space called Friesenwall 120, which was maybe something like a project room, or maybe quite after the 80s, which were a period of a very affirmative period of institutional relations and artistic, mostly male practices, genius practices. It was maybe there at the beginning of the 90s a break where other practices sort of came into the public eye that questioned these strategies and that were maybe more theoretical and more community-based, if you want. And this Friesenwall 120 was, or turned out to be, a collaboration between several artists, one of them Josef Strauh, Merlin Carpenter, Niels Norman, and Kieron Kostler, to name them, because a lot of these things that are called maybe self-organization, collaborative practices, and so forth, have the tendency that a lot of people who were involved with that are then in history writing out of the question, and now the whole stuff sticks at my heels, so to speak, which is problematic to represent that and to speak about that right now. So what was that space, or what made it maybe interesting, was that it was maybe quite early in terms of these things that are later called constituting practices or community space, self-organization, or maybe even commons. So maybe you want to pick out now certain motives that are fitting this discussion here. Important for me was when I started this space, just by chance in a way, because I was looking for studio space, to not be a gallerist, and also not to make it into a producer's gallery, which was a model maybe of the 70s, 80s, that a couple of artists who otherwise don't find a gallery join forces together and then start promoting their work by showing it, showing each other. So it was more like to question these formats of spaces until then. And in the beginning there was maybe a period to test out the space. What is it? Can it be maybe a storage for tires, or can it pretend to be a gallery, like showing famous artists like Wolf Fustel, but who didn't know about that because what was shown were not the real drawings, but drawings from a catalog called Wolf Fustel Drawings. Anyway, this was a kind of testing out the possibilities of the space, and then we went into a phase where, and then I have to talk in the we form because these were other things, testing out things. That was a collaboration with the Grey Panther organization, Senior Citizens. But here with this show, Old News, where basically a newspaper and video archive was in the center of the space, came in a new use, which was more like the question of the archive. What does it represent? How can it be activated? How can the archive also reflect the activities that the archive triggers for the space? And the space through that became, let's say, a hangout for certain people. who were basically also defined through the archive. So if we talk about commons or in the relationship to art, we probably have to see that also not leave the artistic quality or the content out of the question. You know, nowadays often the social just counts as the big surplus of the spaces, but the question is what can attract a social relation. How does a social relation again find entrance into the space? You know, so the question of openness means also that you allow, that you make yourself vulnerable to a certain extent, and that you allow changes to happen that are brought in through the social relations. But they have to be also triggered first, in the first place, through the quality of that what you're doing, in this case within the arts. But in the digital realm it's probably similar, but the issues or the contents is varies, I guess. So after a while, however, this became a little bit too boring just to function as a social place where people would hang out, would contribute, use the archive and would contribute to the archive. Party and conviviality should be mentioned as well as an important quality of that. So at a certain point we thought this was too easy now to just keep it as a youth center or an artist hangout, and therefore we tried to do exhibitions again, which basically didn't really have an author, but they were investigations into maybe forerunner models. The Situationist International, also the East Village scene in New York, or this 80s scene in the 80s in Germany. So yeah, you're looking at the time already. How are we there?
We're doing okay for the time. You've got about, 10 more minutes.
Just please shut me off. I'm absolutely
No,
for.
You've got a couple more minutes.
Okay. So so out of this came maybe the idea of something which could be called Bohemian research. We were then later talking a lot in the universities about artistic research and so forth, and I think we have made an example maybe of that, of a certain self-reflexivity on one hand. What are we doing? What are the forerunner models? And also a question, can that, what we are doing here, be seen as a multiple? Could maybe this kind of way of running a space, could that be disseminated, basically? We did not really actively promote that, but we found other practices that could well connect to what we were doing, and out of this, in the first half of the 90s, came maybe a network of so-called, now we are using the word self-organized, but of self-organized activities in difference to the market activities in the 90s or so. But still always question if these were not forerunner models for something else, and if I should feel guilty about this, which I would really like to do. Yes. So to make it short, a network came into existence as well, and at the end of this period, I mean, thanks God, it ended after 4 years. Not too bad to keep a limited time frame around these activities. I realized actually that this was the period in my life where I learned the most. So out of this came now the idea that actually learning through self-organization, through doing these kind of things, learning basically happens. And that was something that I found in the notion of the academy actually quite at the beginning. So the academy, coming from Plato, is a kind of self-organized teaching and learning, where you don't have this kind of teaching as a broadcast situation and the recipient on the other side, but it is a kind of learning through sharing problems together. And so I went into this question of actually what is an academy, what has it been. That is a book that came out of that and a project at the Kunstverein. And later after this kind of book about the self-organized academies got me a job in an institutional academy, which was really problematic. I was thinking, okay, if you can do the academies yourself, you actually, why am I there, and what are these institutional places good for? And then came in the word research. That happened in Bergen in Norway, and my research then became to see the academy in relation to that what I call a corporate public, which would now probably lead too far. But altogether, out of that came my interest in the last 10 years in that what is called knowledge economy. We ourselves in Munich were very much opposed and damaged through this Bologna process, which I think is an incredible thing that happens in Central Europe of privatization, more or less, of knowledge and of institutions of knowledge production. And here I see that neoliberalism has basically basically appropriated the center of an intellectual production and of the production of knowledge in order to reproduce its own spirit, basically. So the university is now totally in the hands of basically neoliberal strategies with the aim sort of to reproduce itself. That's the big danger, and out of this comes now all the other questions of maybe digital knowledge, knowledge commons, and so forth. And time is over, right?
Time is
very much over. Yes, just a second.
Yeah.
Knowledge is not an ordinary commodity. Knowledge increases miraculously when shared with others. The more knowledge one uses, the more knowledge one produces. Its dissemination increases its effectiveness. Its money equivalent cannot be defined. Its privatization reduces it and contradicts its essence. That's what Andre Gotz writes, and that's my last word.
Thank you. And now Eleanor.
So I guess I want to start by calling into question both the commons and art as the structures that we're investigating here. I think the commons it is a metaphor and a structure for understanding shared resources, which has this kind of very pastoral aspect to it. You know, we think of these peaceful village greens, when actually what we're talking about is, you know, an incredibly brutal process of, you know, either the sharing or deprivation of power and economic resources. And I think that it behooves us to kind of, you know, if we're going to talk about power and we're going to talk about money, we should talk about power and money. And, you know, we can talk about sharing power and money and ways in which we might like those processes to become less brutal, but let's not hide it behind these pastoral illusions. And I also want to kind of poke a bit at art. Something Ben Vickers, who's somewhere in the back there, said at the Serpentine event last October. You know, it's kind of, well, if art ends up being too constraining of a practice, you know, I keep doing whatever it is you want to do. Just stop being an artist. Just stop calling whatever you're doing art. And while I, you know, occasionally use the phrase artist to describe myself, I don't really structure almost any of the work that I do as art. And I think that is another way of kind of getting out from under these kind of pastoral visions of artistic production and what have you, to look at the work we do as labor, the work we do as economics, the work we do as something more central and structural. The enclosures that you brought up are interesting because that was an instance of the transfer of power. And it was the transfer of power in a lot of ways from a kind of tribal and institutional pair of structures where you did have bodies like the church and the nobility that were somewhat of the institutional form, but honestly a village was much closer to a tribal structure, to a community that, yes, money may have been used, but most of the exchange that happened in a community like that was happening outside the bounds of monetary remuneration. And the enclosures was the process of bringing that way of living, that way of being, into the market world, into a much more modern structure. So there's a Rand paper that I'm really fond of, and I don't normally like to trumpet Rand, but they've actually, I mean, I think where they take this paper and where I take this paper are probably very different directions. But it talks about tribes, institutions, markets, and networks as being kind of the four currently existent fundamental structures for organizing people and organizing the collective task of people working together towards some end. We think we have a tendency of seeing networks as being this technologically driven structure, but they're not really. I mean, yes, technology is involved in the structuring of the network, but no one would think of a university, pre-internet, computers, all of that stuff, as being a technologically driven structure now, from our perspective in the 21st century. Well, of course they weren't. I mean, it ran on paper. They were just, writing things down, using printing presses, using the technological structures that became the institution. So I think in the same way, the thing that makes networks interesting is that they're actually just a different way of organizing people that has some technological bits along the side of it. But one of the interesting things that happens, and this is what the bulk of the Rand paper is about, is every time you add a new fundamental organizing structure of humanity to some group, you change what all of the other structures mean. So a post-market institution and tribal structure that attempts to exist without having the market doesn't really entirely work, because the meaning of an institution and the meaning of a tribe has already changed to accommodate that kind of whole where the market would sit. So we're in the middle right now of seeing the move to networks coming in as a new fundamental organizing structure, which means we are in the process of redefining what power means and what resource distribution means for networks, or for all of the elements of society. There is some level at which everything is in question. I don't want to say this question is like a theoretical kind of whimsical process. This is an adversarial and in many ways incredibly hostile, brutal process of different sides carving out a model, and the oligarchs trying to preserve their power at any cost, et cetera, as we move forward. So I think as we talk about the commons and artistic production now, or we talk about the distribution of power and resources and money, looking at it from that frame, that we're undergoing a massive shift in society. Now, you mentioned the sharing economy and that kind of thing in the opening, and I think that that's really prescient and interesting, because the sharing economy is, of course, utter bullshit, right? The sharing economy is basically a bunch of corporations pushing precaritized labor through kind of the decentralizing, or not decentralizing, but the wasting away of the corporate institutional structure, so that it's just completely hollowed out, right? Uber might have some notional relevance as a sharing institution if Uber, the company, was non-profit. If Uber, the company, only served to be an intermediary, but they don't. One of the things I like to say is that APIs are counter-revolutionary. The notion of having a central entity that provides an API that you can interact with the world with and that kind of thing, and that is inherently counter-revolutionary towards a program of equality, because that API is a position of control. That API is a way of reasserting the institution into the form of the network. There's a phrase that I use kind of jokingly called the protocolitariat. And the idea of the protocolitariat is saying, well, what happens if instead of API, we try to structure society along the lines of collectively negotiated protocol? And, you know, this can go off into whatever Ethereum, Bitcoin, wankland, but that's not what I think is actually interesting there. I think there is a radical social form that you can see coming out of that, yes, will be technologically enabled, but it is not primarily of technology. Bitcoin and Ethereum are structured by technology. We need to turn that around and structure technology by human desire. You know, we need to have a dream of the world that we want to build before we start writing code. And I think that, you know, in the meantime, and the way that works, we build structures that are parallel, right? Trying to challenge neoliberal capitalism head on just gets you flattened, especially in our modern surveillance state, et cetera, where, you know, any kind of activism becomes inherently politically suspicious. But we can build things in the cracks. We can build things that aren't recognized as political and economic structures in the same way because they're illegible. You know, our legibility or lack thereof is an incredibly powerful tool and an incredibly powerful way of changing the structure that we are forced to interact with the world on the basis of. And that's one of the really amazing and interesting things about networks, is that they move incredibly quickly and they let us shift around and dodge some of the structures of oppression some of the time, and let us hopefully overcome some of them.
Thanks so much, Eleanor. We're saving all the questions till the end. I'd like to introduce you again.
At the appointed time, members of their group begin to arrive. Individuals engage each other in conversation for a short time, and then when a certain number has collected, a silence falls on the group. After a while, desultory conversations break out again, and then another silence falls. It becomes clear to me that I am in some sense the focus of the attention of the group. Furthermore, I am aware of the feeling of uneasiness that I'm expected to do something. These are the lines from a book called Experiences in Groups, written by the psychoanalyst W.R. Byun in 1948. Byun was known for developing the techniques of group therapy. Through observing group experiences, he hoped to understand the development of the forces that lead to cooperation. He saw treatment as both the product and the common aim of the group. Beyond the text's significance for the field of psychoanalysis, it is the broadly applicable nature of its findings that make it such an important tool. The text has been used to train Arctic field workers and astronauts, because these are people who work in groups in the harshest environments of the world. Some communes have enacted these methods in their tightly knit living units. And now these tools are also used by human resource departments in office buildings. In fact, this text was originally recommended to me by Kathleen Gray, one of the original founders of the Biosphere 2 experiment in Arizona in the 1990s, whose group used this text to better understand group relations and also define the differences between groups and networks. And so, hoping to gain insight into group cooperation, I chose Experiences in Groups as the central text for a 6-week collaborative installation called Recent Work by Artists at Auto Italia. Hello. A group made up of mostly artists would meet on a regular basis to discuss the text and also share our own group working experiences. And the Recent Work by Artists exhibition was a way to visualize a post-studio artist work environment. Auto Italia commissioned this project for their new location in King's Cross in May 2013, and invited a group of artists, including myself, Tim Iveson, Rachel Pym, and George Moustakis, to collaborate on its design. This project began with a seemingly simple question: how do artists work today, and what form can the workspace environment take? A question that led to this ambiguous working environment with many different kinds of activities incorporated in its furnishings. We considered basic needs of the artist's workspace, which seemed to sum up to 3 simple things: power, sockets, toilet facilities, and Wi-Fi. All of these things were already in the space, but what was left to be defined were kind of secondary needs, both emotional and behavioral zones. And this temporary exhibition proposed a kind of a common workspace, and it was open for anyone to come and use it as a workspace. I'm just gonna flip through images to get to the end of this project. In parallel to this installation, I've been co-organizing another collaborative project with some of the same artists. Do you want me to take a different mic? Hello. Highlight different aspects of sustainability of artists' work resources. This project grew out of a conversation between Katie Guggenheim, Tim Iveson, Richard John Jones, and Otto Talia when thinking about creating the space, the discourse, and the community for artist practitioners in London. It is a fluid and constantly changing program of events. For the first year of its existence, this program had no site and no title, simply referred to as the Associates, an association whose common purpose was to create a free program offering professional and educational resources for a peer group of artists, curators, and writers. The decisions were made to keep this project, its members, and the content matter something to be constantly reevaluated. The program was never advertised publicly online or elsewhere, but circulated through emails and word of mouth, amassing into a contact list of people with a particular interest to be involved in the experiment. This program has never. This program is constantly defined by what it is not: an alternative to a school, alternative to a gallery's public program, alternative to a members club, and instead has been compared to a community center or a gym where members are welcome to come and join in on the variety of ongoing activities, including workshops, reading groups, lectures, and studio critiques, as well as steer the program in areas that they're interested in by creating thematic workshops. This is just a list of lectures from the past year. In addition to the speaker series, the members develop thematic content on themes from anything to do with urban development to research methods, systems of self-organization, collecting, tourism, advertising, whatever subjects the members decide to explore. Unlike the resources and recent work by artists that use design and environment to set the stage for work to happen in, the Artwork Association has a different toolkit. The resources are connections and conversations, sharing and testing out ideas, and self-directed learning. This program progresses during monthly group meetings where associates come together to develop upcoming content together. So I've tried to present these projects and ideas less as a chronological narrative, but more for the analysis of their elements. I thought, especially in the context of this event, that I could think about the commons as a kind of ecology of practices and resources. And now I want to use the rest of my time to talk about some of my current research into proposals and models for building new worlds. Something that I've recently written about for Living in the Future magazine. For some time now, my work has been informed by ideas of social experiments and their architectural forms. One recent area of interest has been an example of the International Space Settlement Competition hosted by NASA and the National Space Society. This project is based on an effort to imagine the future of civilization in space, but is also an exemplary failure of imagination of the commons. Since about the 1990s, NASA and the National Space Society have been hosting an annual international space design competition for high school students. These are students aged between 15 to 18 years of age from anywhere in the world to design self-sufficient communities in orbit. Initially, I was drawn to looking at these proposals because they promise to offer a glimpse into the world of the next generation. These proposals have emerged out of a speculative scientific imagination, a moment in Western history when the social norms were being challenged across the board, and space represented a tabula rasa, or a blank slate for thinking about social organization and its environment. But what became increasingly obvious when looking through these student proposals was that I was not looking at some new world as imagined by teenagers, but a high-resolution projection of our current social norms. The students' proposals often range over 100-page-long PDFs outlining the technical means of building a settlement, usually including mining the cosmos for raw material. And then in the second half of the proposals, they focus on the human element, or the life within their designs. The social structures of these settlements are broken down into familiar categories of housing, education, government, law, enterprise, and entertainment. Interestingly, the students of the Space Settlement Contest seem to have a decidedly different interpretation of emotional and spiritual needs of mankind. In many of these proposals, we get iconic descriptions of suburbia with prefab bungalows for nuclear families nestled within tranquil green yards. Located in the town centers are the organizations that make up the cultural and spiritual hubs of the communities. These are always sports gymnasiums and stadiums. In these proposals, 5-star hotels become a necessity, and shopping malls run through the colonies like great rivers. The recurring idea of Earth-like appearances includes not only the simulation of an Earth-like climate, day and night cycles and seasons, but also, in the student words, an Earth-like law and order system. There's a preference for commerce over skilled professions, as many jobs are outsourced to robots. Nurse robots, doctor robots, and justice robots prevail. The colonies are overrun with robot professionals, as each settler gets an assistant robot. And as computers take over the schools, robots replace teachers, and laptops replace classrooms. The synthetic societies played out in many of these proposals seem to suggest a hyper-real dystopia, where risk and human factor have been replaced by automated systems, including rationalized simulation of nature. My own interest and frustration with the competition is that it has both the potential to be a space of critical thinking about social organization, and also emerges out of the history of that very question. The spirit of the project, however, seems to have been overwhelmed by the logic of consumer society, technology, entertainment, and design. The Space Settlements Contest proposals are simultaneously familiar and bizarre in their blend of ordinary conditions and extraordinary circumstance. The settlements are designed by those whose ideas of the future are primarily based on the fantasy and desire or the immediate images of the world of today. Rather than an experimental community, what we see in the space settlements of these teenage students is a mere reflection of our own society, a society of control. Having asked them the question of what their future world looks like, they have mimicked the failures of our own. So this last example is a far more deterministic exploration of elements that make up a culture or a community, but I thought it might be useful for thinking about the topic in more general terms.
Controller around that disappeared. Yeah? Oh, great. I'm going to use this tool. Great. Let me now just find the presentation and all will be great. Okay, where is it? So where did you put that? Oh, there. Yeah, this is a Windows machine. I know how to. Yeah. And no, it's here. You just minimize it. This is Stephan's Grimes album art. Okay. Okay, let me just start here then. Thanks. Yeah. Okay. Cool. Thank you. Thanks for inviting me. Yeah. Thanks for everyone's presentation. You get very freaked out because, of course, there's so much has been said already. So I want to just have this talk about a very specific example, as we tend to think about the internet as a commons, and we tend to think about our own collective, imagination, our collective body of references as a commons. And we're interested at Metahaven in a way that these notions of memes and commons are strategically used by the ever amorphous and ever expanding apparatuses that nation states are using to influence global opinion and to overlay, geopolitics with a layer of cloudified comments and messy aesthetics. But this is an example of that. This is the Japanese pop singer Ayumi Hamasaki, but we'll see her appear in quite a different role very, very soon into this story. So when Russia annexed Crimea, they appointed the 30-year-old Ukrainian chief prosecutor Natalia Poklonskaya to handle those who the Russia-backed Crimea government called the Nazis, and that are those who opposed the annexation. And then RT, which is of course the CNN of Occupy, but also the mouthpiece of the Russian government, added to its broadcasting a program that said that she annexes your heart. Reasons why Crimea prosecutor Poklonskaya are not to be messed with. Okay. So far, everything as expected. But then, in a sort of wag the dog style turn of events, super cute Crimean prosecutor becomes Japanese internet meme. And here we have the two presenters of the RT broadcast sort of struggling their way through a text that's been given to them on paper, not even on auto cue, where they report that spontaneously Poklonskaya became a meme in Japan. Spontaneously, without any form of central coordination, anime artists were starting to draw images of Poklonskaya after a video of her went viral on the YouTube channel YouTube News on March 13, 2014. And YouTube News is a channel that appeared Japanese, but it was created a few days before March 13, 2014, and it has only one video and no subscribers. And the one video is the video of Poklonskaya delivering some speech. So how did that video become viral? How did it become an information cascade with YouTube News having no subscribers and no other videos? So here's the video on RT, and here's the anime drawing. So as Metahaven, we are incredibly fond of making things, but we're also incredibly fond of researching digital forensics and those sort of stuff. So we went to look at the person who made that drawing, and that person is we don't know the real name, but calls it himself herself Itash or Itachi Kanade. Is a Vietnamese anime illustrator, and he or she called the piece "Quick Draw Natalia Poklonskaya," and it's the only drawing in the entire portfolio of this artist with a political resonance and with a highly specific addition of these Russian characters in the caption. All other drawings are these sort of Sailor Moon style characters. And then Itash writes in the comments below the drawing, "It's just a quick drawing when I was bored. I don't think it become popular." As if to emphasize this is not a forced meme, I did this was spontaneous. But actually this artist can be commissioned and has now recently stopped becoming commissioned because started to work as a system administrator. Then Itash includes a link to a YouTube video of Poklonskaya, though not the one on YouTube News that was the alleged catalyst of the viral cascade. Instead, the link is to a similar video posted on a user account awash with videos of Ukrainian conflict, Crimea, Putin, and the Russian military. So here you see some comments below that image. Some people think this is a bit fishy, strange. Anyway, so here's that video. And here we see our pop singer back. Because the username of this YouTube channel is Hiroshima Nagasakieva. And the icon for it is the Japanese pop singer. So it takes some black humor to force Russia and Japan together by making the bombed cities, nuclear bombed cities, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, sound like a Russian female name. So here's the other video. Here's Hiroshima Nagasaki profile, and here's the other videos in that YouTube channel. So we are to believe that a Vietnamese sounding Japanese anime drawing illustrator hobbyist spontaneously found a Russian war-themed channel under the name of Hiroshima Nagasaki. And of course, that's I mean, there's a lot of reason that you can think that this type of meme making is in fact a sort of more centrally controlled than than the word meme would even sort of imply. And then meme being seen as some sort of commons. So in a way, how does this sort of common pool of internet junk being used to create sort of mimetic weapons or mimetic weaponry? So to conclude, to inform is to influence. The Internet Research Agency in St. Petersburg employs about 40 to 50 people that are constantly posting comments on kind of Western media with the idea of influencing. So in May 2014, The Guardian reported and complained about a flood of 40,000 comments a day on its Russia and Ukraine related articles, believing that it was dealing with an orchestrated pro-Kremlin campaign. Well, then again, the Internet Research Agency is a private venture. It's not a government agency. So here we see that there's an intricate way in which these state and non-state work together. Am I on time still? Almost not, right? We think that as we've been involved in this kind of stuff about transparency, etc., that actually we're going the opposite way. We're going to sort of free-ranging fantasy being deployed as this sort of imaginative weaponry. And we are, of course, very interested how we, as self-titled progressives, can basically reappropriate these types of strategies now that states and their agents have basically copied and appropriated this sort of low-sec anonymous type of world that we used to associate with effective political counteraction. Thanks.
I have some pre-prepared questions, but I think this requires some responses, obviously, to the fascinating presentations as well. And I wonder, as you were the last annual, I might open up a question to you along with Eleanor. In terms of the journey of the meme that you just took us through here, and this understanding of the meme as a centrally controlled weapon, can you identify a moment when the platforms such as 4chan, which is a home of Anonymous, might have ever constituted a commons, if now that moment is over, or the moment for perhaps reappropriating the meme as this weapon, and whether that's the proposition of Metahaven. Is it perhaps a kind of call to arms in a sense?
Well, 4chan, there's been a lot of things said about 4chan the past years, basically since 2010, 11, everyone, subscribes, of course, to the story that 4chan is this sort of birth ground, basically the pastoral, version, the digital pastoral land where, things spontaneously emerged. And I think that now that the initial kind of euphoric, celebration of the changing of the world by the meme and the joke and everything, it's a little bit past us. We can also look at these things a little bit more, with more distance, or more looking towards the future. I don't consider, I've tried to launch memes on 4chan myself. It's incredibly difficult / impossible. So Reddit, 4chan, everything, it's incredibly harsh environment where you have to be, in a sense, it's like, you go to this place and you expect that things will spontaneously explode there. It's not like that. And I think that's things even are thinking about the meme as this thing that spontaneously emerges, this pattern that everyone spontaneously copies and everyone wants to have, everyone imitates in a way for themselves, is a sort of to some extent it's true, and to another extent it's a myth that we shouldn't subscribe to so willingly. I guess I think that's the key of the meme today is that the verification requires multiplication, which we see with ISIS, right? Like everyone, even people that haven't seen the beheading videos, have seen the beheading videos. There's Keller Easterling writes this wonderful sentence about the Obama birth certificate, that every time they try to refute the idea that Obama doesn't have the right birth certificate, they have to reproduce the lie or the suggestion in a way. So that is a sort of mimetic multiplication method. But for the rest, 4chan, I don't know. I think we should look beyond 4chan.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess, so I see this Russian meme as being just part of a very long history of information operations that goes back as long as the history of war. I mean, this is a basic tool of statecraft, and it's a tool of statecraft that we've seen used online. Well, let's see, the first time that we had a consultancy that was specifically dedicated towards kind of electronic astroturfing, commenting as a commercial enterprise that did nothing else was 1994 on Usenet. So this is, even on the internet, this is a very, very long tradition. This is done possibly with a slight bit more of sleight of hand, but not much, I mean, really. And I think that there is, distinguishing between an information operation and something more natural is interesting to a point, because it does let us talk about source, and intent and that kind of thing. There is a clear intent driving something like this, but, intent only gets you so far in a kind of a network media structure. I think the notion of any single space as a commons, again, I don't see that as being very meaningful. I think that you have places where, things that networks happen to use, but, it's like saying that, a certain set of buildings in downtown Chicago are a market. No, there are a set of buildings in downtown Chicago. The fact that the Chicago Commodities Exchange happens to be using those buildings is largely irrelevant. You don't look at the buildings and see the market. Or, you can think of a church, right? A church isn't the physical building. A church is, if you're a religious person, a church is the consecration, right? And understanding that there's a distinction there, what is the form, what is the vessel? And I think that is true just as much for this. You can't say that this is a meme. You're pointing at the vessel. You're pointing at the object, not at the mode of spreading. I do think that there's a lot of interesting stuff coming out of states attempting to look at mimetic engineering more rigorously. I think the most interesting slide of the Snowden revelation so far is the GCHQ Joint Threat Research Investigations Group slide deck on large-scale cultural engineering work, of basically starting to look at how do we use ethnography and all this other things, and ritual magic, and there's this whole just amazing set of things they're looking at of to start trying to actually shape cultures and shape societies, and starting small, shaping communities, but really looking up from that as an active performance of intelligence influence operations. So I think there's a lot of territory to go through there.
Thank you. I'm going to just bring Stephan and Julia into the conversation by asking you about the relationship between these questions of networks and sharing in relation to artistic practice. And there's a given narrative of the early internet, of course, that it provided this opportunity for a TAZ, a temporary autonomous zone, in which was kind of overlaid on the given net structure, and this has been squeezed further and further through privatisation. Whether this pastoral commons, as we've been referring to it, ever really existed is something to be debated. But I wonder, in terms of reflecting on artistic practices, how you position yourself in the context of a generation that's come after relational aesthetics, and perhaps relational aesthetics representing a way in which the politics of communities and a commons was imaged rather than actually undertaken, and whether you position yourself in relation to that, or how that operates for you, because of course you're both from different generations, so you might have a different perspective as well as geographies. Julia, do you want to begin?
Yes, sure. Is it working?
Hello. I guess I'm interested, I can see that the history of the internet as the space of the commons has done quite a lot to connect people and create a place to build communities, but I think it is only a tool, and such that it can be used in different ways for different means. It is not inherently a place for any kind of radical community in its own right. The project that I talked about, Artwork Association, we tried to purposely avoid using the internet at all because we wanted but different kind of engagement. And I feel that if that project became a kind of public event that was then documented and presented online, you would engage with it completely differently. And people having to go to the space, to the site, to meet, to discuss ideas, created its own unique microcosm, who comes up, who does what, but it also created an interesting problem that I was telling you earlier about, which is, despite the fact that people remembered and knew that things were happening, a lot of the times, if it wasn't online, they just wouldn't come at all because they didn't believe it or had no way of trusting that things were happening if they didn't see them on the internet. So that's kind of my relationship with it. Even though I might be of a particular generation, I hardly see it as anything other than a tool.
Well, that you've become very aware of the way in which platforms usually operate, and not necessarily to just become a promotional platform for the sake of it, to say our great community, to actually rather network that community in a slightly less public-facing way. That's been a strategy that's been very self-aware in undertaking. And how does that compare, Stephan, to your experience of the imaging of your community as you talk about it? Or I don't know if you would refer to it as a community, but the space in Cologne that you were talking about.
Well, I'm not always working in this community-based way, but looking back then, it was quite interesting that just at the same time came in the thing. I don't know if you're familiar with, but this was maybe even pre-HTML surface of the internet, a kind of BBS-based network of artists, and that came, basically it was next door. And therefore we had this comparison immediately, and I just thought, okay, this is just about communication. It was funny that an event of previous night at our place was then mirrored already in the morning. I could read who basically was drunken and blah. So this was quite an interesting phase of it. Otherwise, I see it very much, of course, the digital realm as and what it offers as tools, but also as, in a way, as a metaphor. I'm very interested actually, and I'm using open source software, and I think there is, in my eyes, much more interesting ways of production, and the fact that all of these, let's say, things in the digital realm are commons that are not depletable, whereas we are working with resources that might be depletable. But still I see the digital realm and this whole idea of the open source software and open source access to information as very helpful metaphors for things that can happen in the so-called real world. Yes, another interesting thing, maybe looking back at the early 90s, was this promise of the information itself. You know, the fact that there was information was really great. You know, we had this archive. This was, of course, a physical archive there, but then that now the internet gives us all the information, and now we live in this absolute abundance of information wars, of total confusion about the information and where it is true. And the recent, or what you were talking now, and the recent Snowden developments and all of these agents, robots that even type in automatically, you know, subvert forums and opinions and blah, 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 shows us actually what a hoax information is in itself. So information is not knowledge, knowledge is not wisdom, wisdom is not truth, and so forth, you know?
And Eleanor, you mentioned earlier the problem of defining what you do within the frame of art, and I wonder if you could just respond to Julia and Stephan in terms of the quite definite framing, you might say, in comparison as art.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, you know, that's a tactical positioning for me. You know, if being an artist is a useful thing for whatever you're trying to do, then be an artist. If being an artist stops being a useful thing, then stop being an artist. This has nothing to do with what you're actually doing. This is just, you know, I mean, this is a choice that we get to play with the way we position ourselves and structure ourselves in society.
I'm just wondering if, from your perspective, you believe that artwork can, I suppose, cross a Rubicon from just being a gesture to doing actual politics.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think that, I guess what I'm saying is that whatever that cultural thing that is doing that work, it can be art, it cannot be art. It doesn't matter what label you put on it, except for the utility of that label and pushing that out into society. You know, if your goal is to get a piece of, you know, to make some change, and it looks like some piece of oppositional art is the way to make that change, great. If it looks like some piece of, you know, meme propaganda that you would never necessarily call art, or maybe you wouldn't call art publicly because it wouldn't work if you called it art. You know, I mean, we can shift around this space a lot more fluidly, and I think this is something which it's really useful to remember, especially when we're in this kind of institutional context. I just want to kind of poke at one other thing that's been said about, like, the meaning of the internet and, you know, was it a commons, whatever. Last fall, I had the opportunity to spend some time with a bunch of the folks that were involved very early on in the creation of the internet, you know, in the late 70s. And this was just after the Snowden releases came out. We were talking politics, obviously. And one of the most hopeful things to me was they were saying, well, okay, look, when we built these technical structures, we had some very specific political mindsets in mind, and those have bred true in the protocols. Now, a bunch of other stuff has been dropped on top of them. The network has been perverted and distorted in all of these different ways. But the things that we did that were still there still mean the same thing that we intended them to. And that, I think, was a profoundly hopeful statement, in that it lets us say that, okay, yes, it is actually possible to build a technical politics of social organization that lasts across deep time.
Thank you. And I'd like to ask Daniel lastly, your response in terms of what you believe artistic practices can contribute, if anything, to shared network spaces or commons, if we can call it that.
I agree with Ella that the use of the term art and making art and artist is is useful when you know what to do with it, and when you know that particular thing that you're doing contributes towards a kind of goal. So, you know, there's ways that art can be seen as part of a contribution to a commons. There's also at the same time a way that art can be viewed as part of a massive expulsion of it's itself a resource. You know, if we talk about the way that, you know, resources can be used, earth, labor, data, and beauty. So there's ways that art is itself one of the prime resources in a process that we, you know, criticize and externalize as being this kind of, you know, Foxconn laborers, you know, the enclosures, etc. But in fact, art is part of that, partially. I think that makes it very strategic as well. If you're really, I mean, you talk about people that make art, like as in terms of art that sells for, you know, certain amounts to certain oligarchs. You talk about art as being people that congregate in networks that are partially overlapping with institutional spaces that provide some of the funding. You talk about self-declared units of making, or groups of people that make things, and that do so always in a kind of permanent negotiation with the outside world. I think our studio Metahaven falls in the latter category, in the fact that I would be very wary to claim ourselves being so radical as to exist out of any sort of, you know, proprietary or other form of, you know, dependency on existing structure. So I think, and also there's another notion to art and the part that it plays in gentrification. So the fact that, you know, the art galleries and the lattes and all those things are the first, you know, they're the kind of the conquest of space by hypercapital is always preceded by a wave of art galleries and of coffee bars and etc. So I think that for me it's very hard to answer those questions in general. I think we can only answer it from our own, I can only answer it from my own perspective and my own practice. And then I think that our choice to sometimes work with people that would never work with us if they hadn't received an email from us is one of the most ideological things that we can do. That we try to engage, and not always successfully, with people that are far outside our own social graph, and that work on things that we think are necessary for the world to become better. And then we think that design, art, can definitely make a contribution, but it's in the combination, it's in the alliance, it's in the collaboration with people that do things that you personally couldn't do, and that you maybe never heard of even before you knew that particular group. So that's one thing, one way in which we can do something. Yeah.
So just picking up on the strategies that Daniel was talking about, I wonder, Julia, if you could talk a little bit about the strategies for forms of sociality to emerge, and perhaps in particular in London, as we've got a panel internationally here, can pick up on various geographies. But do you have a particular a strategy in that, or do you see a particular way in which these have emerged in your experience in London?
I guess in London there's noticeably a lot more energy around artist-run spaces, and maybe, as you mentioned, in the call for the discussion, that might be changing. But so far, there's been a lot of kind of voluntary energy and temporal spaces where little communities pop up and create discussions around themselves. And I like working within those groups and creating little alternative spaces. And then, of course, there's the problem that Daniel brought up about how those lead to maybe driving other communities out. So it's always a constant kind of cycle of questions and dilemmas within our work. I don't think I have any answers, but I think they're important moments in places and time, and it's important that they keep creating that voluntary energy and moving around the city.
So, Stephan, just picking up on that, I don't know if you want to make a comment first, but I was just going to ask in relation to the temporality which you talked about, the moving around, and this is perhaps a strategy that's cited in terms of the commons that you know, you need to continue to shape shift, and also so shift your strategies and geographies. And Stephan, you said quite definitely that it was a temporary project, and that was important. That it was temporary and it didn't try to maintain or institutionalise itself. Could you talk a little bit more about that, perhaps, as a strategy, the temporary?
Okay, I want.
Or if you have another comment.
Well, I wanted first maybe a short reply to Daniel and the question of the strategy. I mean, basically, I agree how you mapped out the fields of the arts and these different ways. But the question with the strategy and the agenda is, do you really have to have one, or is it so important? I see that as a problem, for example, for research in the arts or elsewhere, and also research in institutions, that it comes always with or has to come with a strategy, with a promise. We have to apply for money, and therefore we say we want to achieve that goal, and therefore we plan a strategy, and therefore everything is mapped already from the first place. And I thought always that if we talk about the arts, it's actually something that has to be defined in its time. You know, it is an open kind of word, an open process, and also boredom, not knowing what to do, finding people who are similar maybe but different enough, people who share maybe similar likes or problems, can lead to processes of definition of what art might be in that context and how it would function. So to keep the strategy and the agenda so much in the front of the whole problem seems to be, for me, a little bit problematic. I mean, I see art still as a kind of an open, still to be defined kind of thing. Do you want to immediately?
No, I don't want to interrupt you. First of all,
okay, but you wanted no. Please, you can.
Well, I think you can talk about agenda and plan, but you can also talk about desire, a word that Ella mentioned before, and I think that can also be a strong driving force, driving you forward.
I mean, I guess when I was talking about, you know, purpose or whatever, it's intent. Read that as, you know, you're making some gesture that might or might not be artistic, and there's some intent behind it. It doesn't necessarily have to be a specific strategized intent. It can be a merely expressive intent. And I think that in some ways it's, you know, saying, oh, I've got this piece of oppositional culture and it's more useful for me to do it outside of the traditional art world, that's very well understood. I think it's slightly more radical to say I have this piece of expressive intent that is kind of that very core artistic thing, but I'm not doing that inside the art world for some other reason, you know, because it lets me actually express that intent better, express that desire better.
I wanted to now maybe pick up on something you mentioned, Daniel, about the contacting particular individuals or organisations that you wouldn't otherwise, and that's a methodology or strategy, or however we want to phrase this. But I wondered that maybe across the whole panel what this means in terms of collaboration, which is a terminology that's become very much associated with a particular politics in relation to art practice, which is very smooth, and to maybe reinsert some of the tension within that. Julia, you were talking about your research around working in groups, and then Daniel, you were talking about the pragmatics of it. And I just wonder how far we've travelled from the 20th century, the 1930s and 70s especially. There were particular moments where art is very much identified with collaboration, and now more towards a kind of working pragmatically in groups and what that might mean for commons.
So each give a short sort of response to that?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, for myself, we come from a slightly different field, namely graphic design, which had a mythical agent, you know, in charge of almost all choices, the client. and this client figure is this mythical other, that basically empowers designers in their own, imagination, like until the recent past, with the agency to actually do something. So you have a client, and that client actually enables you to speak to the public. Of course, now that we see that traditional clienthood changes and largely changes, sometimes disappears, and we see that the middleman, as in the designer, is no longer this kind of party that mediates between like institutions and the public necessarily. Of course, designers have to reinvent what it is they're doing, and then you could say that relationships is what design is about, and client is one form of relationship, but there's many other relationships possible. Some are monetizable, some are not monetizable, and some might lead to some other form of sustained existence into the future. And I think designers like ourselves, but there's others too, obviously, are finding out what that means.
I think looking at that kind of collaboration from a network perspective, you start looking less at a collaborative structure and more at a shared performance or a shared enactment of some protocol of collaboration. And there may still be a kernel of structure in the negotiation of that protocol, which is a thing that has kind of tradition and pastness across different communities and cultures. But I think that we are seeing a bit of a shift towards a more explicitly and self-aware performative nature of that kind of collaboration, not from the aspect of performance-centric work, but like the piece that you were talking about at Arcadia Missa, where it was this very kind of intentionally performed collaboration, and it was as much about setting and exploring the structural rules of that interaction as it was whatever. Like that was the interesting part of that collaboration.
Yeah, I think collaboration can happen, of course, on all different kinds of levels, but I wanted to point out maybe that what I call Bohemian research. First of all, the question is, what is Bohemia anyway? So it's a very dispersed thing, which enables people to meet people that drift together or come together like elective affinities. People who share certain problems, but they are similar enough and different enough to sort of get interested in each other. And out of that, as we know in the history of the avant-garde, also come research-like activities that can lead to new findings. Yeah.
I guess I wanted to collaborate with artists for all the obvious reasons, like critical discussion and having people to shoot your ideas off of. But the thing that I found interesting when looking closely at my own research with artists and also groups that work in different fields in groups, I found that those relationships and those projects are always really chaotic and made up of systems of things that you can't really predict, people who bring their own little things to the mix, and then you always end up with something that actually goes against what you think collaborative practice does, which is something a bit more anarchic and jumbled. But then there's also these subtleties within collaborative practices. Like I was interested in the fact that when I was talking to Kathleen Gray, who has worked in groups all her life, her group is called Institute of Ecotechnics, and they live together, they work together, they develop scientific experiments together, and I called them a group or a commune. She said, no, we're not, we're a network. And it was such a interesting kind of discussion to be had even within the different ideas of how people relate to each other in their work practices, I guess.
Thank you. I'm just going to give one more question to the panel before I open up to the floor. And I wanted to ask Eleanor, but the others might also have responses, what you see as the potential consequences for collectively managing resources in terms of encryption, in terms of security and your specialism.
That's a long conversation
So
and a somewhat large topic. I guess the
for artistic practices, maybe. Than to focus it
Encryption's a tool, but I think the thing which is much more interesting there along those lines is decentralization, right? Because encryption is a tool for shifting around control, you know, and if we want to talk about collective management, we are in part talking about decentralization, removing a single institutional choke point and allowing that to move into a more negotiated collective space with some protocols for interaction. And this is where we get back to the, you know, yes, you can look at decentralization, you know, in the context of physical technical networks and the kind of structures of control and encryption and key management and whatever that go with those. But actually what matters and what we care about is the human thing and where the human resources are. Not human resources as in people, but the, you know, the money and the space and the whatever that we're actually trying to manage or share or do whatever with. And so I think that understanding and analyzing architectures of control as social practice is an incredibly useful tool for our current time.
Okay, I'd like to open up to the floor now. I think we'll have a mic roving, so it'd be great if you could wait till the mic arrives before you ask your question, just at the back there.
Hello. Yeah. Going to ask you actually to reveal your sources, if you will. I'd like to know the name of that book about group work that's used by astronauts, and also, Eleanor, if you could, if not here, then if you could tweet that RAND paper that you mentioned on enclosure, and also where can we read about GCHQ doing ritual magic? That would be cool. Thank you.
I'll send out some Twitter links later.
I mentioned mine. It's Experiences in Groups by W.R. Bion. I think it's Wilfred Bion, 1948.
Okay, are there any other questions? Yeah, we've got one at the front here from Rosia.
I just want to say one clarification with Julia's show wasn't at Arcadia Missa, it was at Auto Italia in North London. But the actual question I have is that, Eleanor, you mentioned kind of working in the cracks and kind of almost like parallel forms of resistance to envisage what we would like society to look at, and you're kind of creating something new. And I wondered if you could maybe give examples and also expand a bit on, because it seems in a way oppositional to a politics of refusal, or kind of like resistance in a kind of, well, like you said, in a much more explicit way. It seems like more covered. I mean, you mentioned surveillance, but maybe could we?
So I think, the reason why I talk about, building stuff in the cracks and finding the spaces is because we have to live, and you can go out there and bash your head in a cop's forehead and see how that does for you, but, it's much more useful to just be in the shadows sometimes. And this is a transient and a tactical understood politics where, we work in parallel and maybe stay in the cracks now until we're big enough that we can move into the daylight, either that we have to or that we can survive. So it's always very much a negotiated politics of terrain. For a more concrete example, Lima Zulu has been such a space for a good while. Lima Zulu is an artist project space in North London. For those of whom who don't know it here, it's kind of the prototypical, big warehouse, bunch of people living there, works as a gallery, sort of mostly hangs together, that has managed to squeak by in some of the cracks. I think that era is almost certainly coming to a close, but one of the things which is interesting in London right now is there's a massive amount of completely empty Class A office space. And I think maybe the new peripheral warehouse district artists group is Class A office space in Shoreditch.
If you'd like to